Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Ukrainian proxy forces. Additionally, I may cover an additional topic right after we look at what is happening in and around Ukraine. Now, again, we are continuing to see Russian forces maneuver both to the east and to the southwest of Pokrovsk. If you look at this continued salient by Russian forces, now moving due west of Pokrovsk, the eventual strategy is the ultimate envelopment of this area by Russian forces. Now, when the Russians eventually take control of Pokrovsk or envelop it, to which the Ukrainians do not have the ability to continue to supply its forces in this area, you're going to see a domino effect take place. You will see the fall of additional cities both to the west and to the northeast as the Russians continue its ongoing Donbas offensive. Now, additionally, we've got some new numbers in terms of what the Ukrainian army has been able to do since last year, back towards February 2024. And now these new numbers, it is understood that about 40,000 Ukrainians have actually volunteered for Ukrainian military service, and that 40,000 has been the entire year, going back to February 2024 to where we're at now. Now, at the same time, we are continuing to see about 20 to 35,000 Russians volunteering every month. These are not conscripted forces. These are Russians volunteering to be contract service members with the Russian military. Again, 25,000 to nearing, in some cases, 40,000 per month. As I've talked about before, that equates to essentially one Russian corps being recruited every month. As we speak, the Russian military is continuing to grow month in and month out, day in and day out. Now, looking at the Ukrainian side of the equation, again, 40,000 have volunteered over the course of an entire year. Now, that says something. That tells you that the Ukrainian war is very unpopular. And because of the casualties that have been taken by the Ukrainian military, the likelihood that young, middle-aged Ukrainians, young 18 to 30 years old, all the way up even to middle-aged Ukrainians, undoubtedly do not want to risk life and limb serving in this conflict. Now, you continue to hear about, at least from the Ukrainian state side of things, that they are killing and injuring large amounts of Russian military. If that was the case, do you really believe that the Russian military would be signing 25,000 to 40,000 Russian troops every month? Again, these are volunteers. These are not conscripted forces. So the short answer to that is simply no, that's not the case. If the Russians were really taking those kinds of casualties, and especially given the length of the conflict, it would have eventually made its way to the general population, the general Russian population, where you would inherently see a decrease in the amount of Russians volunteering. And that's not the case. So again, the Russian capacity, and partly is due to a larger population base, but at the same time, they are more successful in this conflict than the Ukrainians are. And again, this goes back to the mass use of artillery and air power. The Russians have that advantage. They have that capability, whereas the Ukrainians don't. And that is why we're seeing what we're seeing in terms of the Ukrainians being able to recruit about 40,000 over the course of the year, and the Russians essentially doing that every month. Now, the Ukrainians are able to obtain additional forces through the use of forced conscription, and that's what we're seeing. When we observed some of the Ukrainian combat brigades that evaporated southwest of Pokrovsk, some of those brigades that were formed in Europe, France, and other locales, those units, many of those soldiers were conscripted into service. Some were volunteers, but by and large, a great many are pressed into service. So when they have the opportunity to desert or AWOL in Europe and get out of the Ukraine, they're taking advantage of that opportunity. They're staying in Poland, or they're trying to stay in Poland, or they try to migrate their way into France, or they train in France and then try to defect in France and then find themselves into other European nation states where they can seek asylum. And that's widespread. Again, early in the conflict, back in 2022, a little bit different. The Ukrainians were very successful in creating volunteer fighting formations, but as the conflict has continued, that effort to get volunteers has lost favor. The Ukrainians are not volunteering for this conflict anymore. And thus, we are seeing this continued war of attrition by the Russians, right now focused in the Donbas. Now, additionally, we have received reports that Ukrainian forces have launched a localized, battalion-sized offensive operation in the southeast quadrant of the Kursk salient. Now, we understand that Russian drones and air power have negated that initial attack by the Ukrainians. We're not sure what the objective of the Ukrainian military is when they launch these battalion or multiple battalion size attacks against Russian forces, other than to say they are attempting some sort of offensive operation. But these offensive operations that the Ukrainians have launched in Kursk have been incredibly ineffective. They have resulted in the widespread loss of equipment and manpower by the Ukrainian military, and the Russians have essentially locked this area down. The Ukrainians launch their company-sized, battalion-sized operational group against the Russian front line and are immediately counterattacked by Russian forces, or Russian air power, drones, and artillery negate the capability of those attacks, making them essentially fruitless. But again, if we go back to the Donbas area of operations, the Russians continue to push. Now, there are essentially two main supply routes into Pokrovsk. The Russians have cut off two of the four main routes into Pokrovsk, and they will continue to push to the north, into the both to the north-northeast and to the north-northwest, until Pokrovsk has been completely enveloped by Russian forces. That is eventually going to happen. There's very little the Ukrainians can do to prevent that from happening. Now, you may ask, well, why is this going so slow? Why are the Russians not just barging into Pokrovsk and launching a massed assault to take the city. Well, they're trying to prevent casualties. They're doing this in a very methodical way. I've talked about this before. It is a very methodical way in which they are locking down Ukrainian forces and then using air power and drones to destroy Ukrainian forces in zone and then continue forward. And that's what the Russians are doing. Now, I wanted to touch on one other subject. I had posted that piece of content earlier about South Africa. What is happening to the South African farmers. And apparently there is this thought that at one point there must have been this thriving sub-Saharan African civilization in what is now South Africa. That is not the case. Eventually, Africans, Bantu-speaking Africans, made their way into South Africa during the Bantu expansion. Now, what caused that original Bantu expansion from West Africa and Central Africa? Difficult to say. There's a lot of theories on that. But when the Dutch and the English arrived in South Africa in the 1600s and the 1700s, it was an incredibly sparse population. There were no thriving cities, there were no thriving towns, there were nomadic herders. The Bantu peoples that attempted to enter into especially Southwest Africa and what is now the Transvaal, the Orange Free State, they knew and they understood feral farming. These Bantu-speaking peoples did not have the farming technology to stay in many of these areas. And even today, you can kind of see that if we, let me try to zoom in here and give you, the viewer, an example. I mean, clearly you can see that very few people are living in these areas. Now, you can go into some of these areas and you can see these farms, these Afrikaan farms, these flourishing farms, because they had the farming technological know-how to farm in these very arid environments. And that's what they did. There was no one living here. There were no Bantu-speaking people living in the area that you're looking at right now. No one was there. The Dutch eventually moved into these areas, what are now the Afrikaans, and they had the farming know-how to create these thriving farms. Now, what's happening is that the current government in South Africa is attempting to seize these farms and hand it over to people who do not understand farming. They would not know how to operate these farms. I mean, it's a little bit more insidious than that. But again, just touching on the point that, okay, the Dutch, the English move in and they colonized an existing group of people that were living in this area is complete and utter nonsense. There was no one here. There was no one here. Didn't exist. Now, look, as for the KwaZulu-Natal and the Zulus, obviously a little bit different in that area. But at the same time, you still had the homelands. And those were the traditional areas of some of these Bantu-speaking people. And those areas were never taken by the Afrikaans. They did not take that land. That land to this day is owned by the Bantu-speaking peoples that eventually migrated into those areas. So in the comment section, if you say that these Dutch who became the Afrikaans entered into an area and took that area from an existing group of people, that is simply not true. There was no one there. It was seen as bad land that could not be occupied. And thus, the Dutch were able to occupy it, and they built thriving cities. Pretoria, for example. No one was there. They created it. All right, well, do some research, search on your own, and eventually you will come to the same conclusion. As always, thanks for joining us. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.